Have you wanted to try a knitting machine blanket but don't know where to start? Have you asked yourself how many tubes and how many rows per tube do I knit? How much yarn do I need? And how do I join the tubes together? If this sounds like you, then you are going to love this cheat sheet pattern. Hey everyone, it's Mary at Calumet Knits. I'm excited to show you these gingham blankets. I have been working on this pattern design for about 8 months and I love how it turned out. This video accompanies my new Ultimate Knitting Machine cheat sheet pattern for gingham blankets. Starting a knitting machine blanket can be overwhelming. This pattern will break down every step of the process for you to create your own gingham blanket. Each step has been carefully designed using alternative techniques to create a flawless finish of the blanket on both the front and back sides. So let me show you the different samples and how the different size machines look. These are all crib size blankets made on 6 different machines. Yes, 6. And there's 8 blanket sizes included in the pattern for each of the 6 machines. First is the 22 needle machine with a 3-inch square, and this is made with big twist worsted. The second is the 32 needle machine with a 4.5-inch square. This was made with Premier Basic DK yarn. Then the 40 needle machine with a 5.5-inch square made with Premier Basic DK yarn as well. The 44 needle machine with a 5.75-inch square made with Baby Bee Sweet Delight yarn from Hobby Lobby. The 46 needle machine with a 6.75-inch square made with Big Twist worsted. And last up is the 48 needle machine with a 7-inch square made with Big Twist worsted as well. Here are the 3 most popular sizes next to each other: the 48 needle, the 40 needle, and the 22 needle machines. You can see how the different size machine makes a big difference in how the finished gingham pattern looks. Keep in mind, the smaller the machine size, the more squares in your blanket and a better defined gingham pattern. So let's look at the 22 needle machine sample. I'll open this up so you can see the whole pattern and how beautiful it looks. The squares are lined up perfectly on the front side of the blanket. And now for the back side, you can see the squares are lined up perfectly even on the back. You may notice a slight curve to the squares. This is because we're knitting in a spiral. However, most people don't notice this at all because of how the blanket changes its shape when it's being handled. Let me show you the difference between each size looking at a bigger area of the pattern. First is the 22 needle versus the 32 needle. There is definitely a size difference. Next is the 32 needle versus the 40 needle. Even though these two look similar, the 40 needle, you will need less tubes to make the same size blanket. This is the 40 needle versus the 44 needle machine. And it is very hard to tell the difference between these square sizes. Okay, the 44 versus 46 needle. You can definitely see a difference in the square sizes. And lastly is the 46 needle versus 48 needle. And I don't see much of a difference at all between these two. I think the square size was a difference of 1/4 inch. And here is the doll size blanket using the 22 needle machine. So how cute is this little set for a sweet little one? So let's talk about the cheat sheet pattern real quick. It includes 6 machine sizes and 8 blanket sizes. You'll receive the cheat sheets for all 6 machines, including how much yarn you need, a gauge list to keep track of your yarns, the gauge chart, a project worksheet, 3 different worksheet charts depending on which size blanket you choose, a color options chart, and the written instructions, which comes out to be a total of 40 pages. So let me show you how I created this adorable doll size using some alternative techniques. Each one of these techniques is vital to creating a flawless look on both sides of the blanket. These techniques include creating a gauge swatch, casting on, changing colors, binding off, finishing the tube ends, joining the tubes, and lastly, finishing the blanket. So let's start with measuring your gauge swatch. So I have my swatch here, and I'm just going to take a measurement going across the width of the tube, and in this one it's 3 inches. And I also need the row gauge, which is the number of rows within 4 inches. So I mark off the 4 inches using some straight pins, and then I will count the number of rows in between the pins. So once I have these 2 measurements, the width of the tube and the row gauge, I can go ahead and record these on our worksheet, and then I can get started working on knitting the tubes. So making the color change on the machine is a little bit different than what you're used to. Start by casting on with waste yarn and knitting about 4 or 5 rows. Change to your main color, and we're going to change color at the number 1 needle position, and then we're going to knit the number of rows per the chart. And for the beginning square, we're always going to add 1 extra row to the number of rows that you need. This extra row will be used to slip stitch the edges closed so that our squares will still be square. Instead of changing color at the number 1 needle like we normally would, we're actually going to go 1 needle over and make our color change on the number 2 needle. Insert your new color and hold on to your tails and crank a little bit. We're going to go almost all the way around. I want this color change stitch almost to pop up. I'm going to use my loom hook and insert it in between the 2 little tabs and pull back on the stitch and crank at the same time. This is going to keep that previous row stitch on the machine so that we can knit those 2 stitches together. And then you can go ahead and continue with the number of rows that you need. Let me show you how I create the knot in the tails. You can see this stitch here is fairly loose, and this stitch over here is loose. All I want to do is pull on the tails just enough to tighten those 2 stitches up a little bit. And then I can go ahead and tie my knot. Now I'm not pulling the stitch next to it over. I'm only removing the slack from those 2 stitches. So let me show you the color change again, and then I'll show you a different angle. So remember, we're changing color on the number 2 needle. Hold your tails just a little bit and crank almost all the way around. I'm waiting for that number 2 needle to pop up. I'll insert my loom hook and pull that stitch back. Crank the machine a little, and that needle's pop up so it's not going to fall off. And I'm holding my tails just to make sure that loose stitch stays on. Now here's a different view of what we're doing. Here's the stitch that I want to keep on, number 2. Just slightly pull back on that stitch a little bit with your loom hook, and then crank and you'll see the needle pop up. That keeps it on the machine. And then on this side, I wanted to show you that there are 2 stitches here. We have our color change stitch on the top and the previous row stitch on the bottom. And we're going to knit those 2 together, so we need to make sure that both of those loops stay towards the bottom. For every color change that you need to do, we'll do it on the number 2 needle, and when you get to the very end, your last square, you're going to add 1 additional row that's going to help with the slip stitch. And when you switch to waste yarn, we're going to switch at the number 1 needle. So cast on with the number 1 needle and bind off at the number 1 needle. Make all your color changes at the number 2 needle. Now another thing that's a little different when I bind off my waste yarn is I actually use my tapestry needle and thread the waste yarn through so that I don't drop any stitches while I am working with the tubes. Now this is optional. This is just something I do to avoid drop stitches while I'm working with the tubes. Once the tube is off the machine, you want to mark the cast on edge with some type of marker. All of these steps are important to lining up your tubes for seaming so that we align all of the squares properly. So here's our tube off the machine, and I'll show you the join. These first 2 intersections here, I tied the knot on the machine, and you can see how well that looks. The rest of them, I did not tie the knot because I want to show you here how you can do that off the machine if you choose. Once the tube is turned inside out, you can see that these stitches are loose, and we'll use the same process that we would if it was still on the machine. We'll just pull on those tails just a little bit to tighten up those 2 stitches, and then you can go ahead and tie your knot. I'll go ahead and finish tying all these knots and turn the tube right side out, and I'll show you what these color changes now look like. So let's look at how we do the slip stitch for the cast on edge. The cast on edge has this half stitch that it creates, and we need to finish this stitch in order to have our tubes be square from end to end. So we'll go in, we'll follow that waste yarn tail and insert our hook into the last 2 loops, and then yarn over with our tail and pull it through. So now that stitch is complete, and the last thing I do is pull the waste yarn tail out of those same 2 loops so it doesn't get hung up on the stitch when I remove the waste yarn. Now we're able to finish slip stitching both ends closed. They should look the same at this point. With the tube folded and our tails on the left side, I'm going to count over half of the number of stitches. So in my case is a 22 needle machine, half of that is 11. And I'm going to insert the hook into that 11th stitch and the 12th stitch and pull the 12th through. Then I'll go up to the top, pull that stitch through, go to the bottom and pull that stitch through. And keep alternating between the top and the bottom until we get over to the left side and the last stitch, which we will pull all the way through. By using this method of slip stitch, we will create the same column of stitches on the two sides of our tube, from the top of the tube down to the bottom of the tube. If you don't complete that half stitch, or you start on the wrong stitch when you start to actually pull stitches through, you won't end up on the same column of stitches on your cast on edge and your bind off edge. And that's really important for this pattern, because we're going to use those edge stitches, column of stitches, to seam together, and we don't want our tubes to twist at all. So here I am getting down to the last two stitches, and when I pull the last stitch through, I will just keep on pulling, and it will pull the tail all the way through and secure that last stitch. Now I can go ahead and remove my waste yarn. And this is what our slip stitch edge looks like when we are finished. Let's seam these two tubes together. So I have tube number 1 and tube number 2 laid out horizontally here, and where I'm pointing to is the color change row on the tubes, and you'll notice that it is on the back side, or what I'm calling the back side, of our blanket. Now I have my cast on edges marked with the stitch markers on the left side, and I have the tails coming off the top edge. So lining these tubes up is very important to aligning the squares. So we need to identify the column of stitches that we are going to use for seaming. So on tube number 1, I'm going to start at the very corner here, and you'll notice the column of stitches has the V pointing to the left. This is the column of stitches we want to use. So I'm going to follow this down towards the middle of the tube, and I'll place a stitch marker. This is going to be the area where I'm going to start. And then if you keep following it down all the way to the other end, you'll see that it comes out perfectly at the corner. Now on the other tube, we want the inside column of stitches, and I'll do the same thing. I'll start in this bottom corner. Again, I want to identify the column of stitches with the V's facing the left, and then I'll follow that column to the middle and place a stitch marker. And then just to verify, I'm going to go all the way to the other end to make sure it comes out at the corner, and it does. So now we are ready to start seaming. Start in the center tube at this square here and here. So I have a piece of working yarn that I cut to about twice the length of my tube. So start by picking up your tubes so that you can see these two side column of stitches. And I'm going to insert my needle so that I can see the bars in between the stitches here. And what I'm looking for on this first tube are the first two light purple bars. You can see there's 2 dark purple and then 2 light colors. And I want to pick up those 2 light colors first. And you'll notice that the outer stitch is there's 1 purple, dark purple, and 1 light purple. This is where I want to start. So I'm going to pull my working yarn about halfway through, and then I'll go over to tube number 2, and I'll insert my needle. And what I'm looking for here, I want 1 light purple bar and 1 white bar. So it's these 2 middle stitches here. So I'll take my needle out and insert it where I need it. And you'll notice here that both stitches are light purple on the outside. So pull your yarn through and notice that I'm holding these 2 tubes so that I can see the column of stitches that I want to use. So go down through the same hole as the previous stitch is coming out and insert your needle and pick up 2 more bars. And then go over to the second tube and do the same. So insert your needle where the previous stitch is coming out, same hole, and pick up 2 bars. And then you just alternate between the 2 tubes, picking up 2 bars at a time. Now what I like to do after each square here is pull my tails tight so I can see how this intersection looks. Here's the front side, and then I'll flip it over for the back side. And both sides look really good. So I'm going to flip it back to the front side and continue to pick up 2 bars on each side until the next intersection. It's important to stay within the same column of stitches. So you'll notice that I kind of fidget with the 2 tubes a little bit so that I can see these 2 columns clearly. As you're inserting your needle, be careful not to pick up or snag the fabric in other areas. You only want to pick up these 2 bars. So I don't know if you notice, but I kind of lift each one as I go, and that just by feel I can see if I'm picking up more than I need, and if I do, I just back it off and try again. So I just passed another intersection of the square, so I'll go ahead and remove some of the slack to verify the look of that intersection. And it looks pretty good from the front side, and I'll check the back. So I always remove the slack after each intersection. I check the front and the back sides to make sure everything's lined up properly. And now I'll continue on. So at the end of the tubes here, I'll just continue on until I have run out of stitches, picking up 2 bars, and in some instances you may only have 1 bar to pick up, and that's okay. So I've turned my work so that I can finish seaming towards the other end of the tube. So always turn your work, don't flip it. You always want to make sure you're working from the front side of your blanket. Now, I've come to this intersection and I wanted to show you that I've made a mistake. I only knit 14 rows of this light purple next to this 15 rows of white, and it didn't line up properly. So I'm going to go ahead and unstitch it, and I'm just counting my rows again to verify. and sure enough, my purple is 1 row short. So we can fix this. I'm going to unstitch to about the middle of the purple square. And because the purple is short one, I'm going to pick up 2 bars of the white and only 1 bar of the light purple. And then I'll continue with the pattern of picking up 2 bars on each side. This is going to even out the intersection here, and it's going to look like I didn't make a mistake. So I would avoid picking up more than 2 bars at a time. If you think you need to make a 3-bar jump, I would back up a little bit and do 2 bars to 1 bar, and then do another 2 bars. It will be a better seam, and if you do more than 2 bars, you could end up with a hole in your seam, and you don't want that. Okay, now that we have our first seam done, I'm going to leave all of my tails until the very end. And you can see the back looks really good, and the front side looks really good as well. Now we stretch this seam. This is going to allow this working yarn to move with the blanket as we use it. Simply pull on each end without holding on to the seam yarn. So now let me show you how to seam the next tube on. So we're going to line things up the same way. I have my stitch markers on the left, the tails coming off the top, and I want to find that column of stitches along the very edge. So identify that column of stitches starting in the corner of one end, and your V's will open to the left, and just follow that same column down, place your stitch marker, and do the same thing on the next tube and place your stitch marker. Again, your V's will be to the left, opening to the left, and we're ready to start stitching. So insert your needle into that column of stitches, and we want to find the 2 white bars. And so I'll back up my needle a little bit, I'll only pick up those 2 white bars, and then go over to the next tube, and I want to find 1 dark purple and 1 purple bar. Now this process is the same as the other tube that we seamed together. The only difference is the color. So it's actually the same starting place, but they're just different color stitches. So from here, you're just going to pick up 2 bars on the bottom, 2 bars on the top, and continue across until the end of the tube. When you reach the end, you're going to turn your work and work the same, picking up 2 bars from each tube until you reach the end. Since the tubes are knit in the round, we are actually knitting in a spiral. Aligning the squares has been a difficult process. This is why I have created a detailed process, starting with the work that is done on the machine, then the specific slip stitch process, aligning the tubes for seaming, and the starting points for seaming. All of these elements combined together make for the perfect gingham look on the front and back sides of the blanket. So in my sample here, I have the tail from the tube, and I'm going to hold it kind of on the back side, and then I have my seaming yarn, and I'm going to find a stitch on one side, and then I'll find a stitch on the other side. And then I'll go through that first stitch again. The last step is to move both tails to the back side where you can knot them together and then finish burying the tails. So you'll do this for each join section, and when you're done, you'll just bury all the tails and you'll be finished. I hope you enjoyed the video on how to make a gingham blanket. I will link to the pattern in Ravelry and Etsy below, and if you have any questions, just feel free to give me an email. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.